What you are about to witness is a fascinating interview with a gentleman called Christopher Spencer, or rather that is his pen name. He has to conceal his real name. In the following interview, Christopher speaks about his 50 plus years in the world of high-level finance, both as a banker and a finance and investment broker. He covers everything from international espionage to covert financial agreements, conmen, murder, war, and more, with a touch of personal flair. Everything you are about to hear is true. Some questions were pre-agreed and scripted to explain specific content in his books. Most are not. You can find details of where to buy his books in the video description below. This is part 9. How did you move on to where you are now? I would call you an independent investment broker. Would that be accurate? And would you like to tell us about what you actually do now?
Yes. I'm now retired. I got the benefit of a couple of pensions, which is very good, and so I can make a choice. I suppose if you're working for an employer, you don't have much time usually to carry out any other work. But my choice has been to continue working first of all because I want to do that. I want to keep my brain active, and I'm working now on various green technologies, partly because it keeps me in business and with international contacts and keeps giving me a challenge, if you like, to be able to continue work. Also because I'm interested in the future of the world. I mean, I've got children, I've got grandchildren. The world at the moment seems to be in a very perilous state. Climate change is definitely there. I don't believe in climate change denying. It is there, it's happening. Having said that, there's always been climate change and always will be. Remember the ice ages. But it is clear that by pouring lots of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we are changing the world and other pollutants that go into the atmosphere as well, for that matter. What we've got to do is to be, as a species, as a human species, is to be adaptive. And I'm working on some technologies that I hope will be able to let us become adaptive to that situation. I'm also working on some other developments, some inventions that will help the world in other ways. So I'm trying to become, in my old age, rather green, I suppose, but I recognize that things have to be done and you have to think about future generations. Otherwise, we will perish.
Do you feel that it will help you to balance out things you did earlier in your career, especially in the construction industry and maybe other things you may not want to talk about? Or is it just simply a natural process? You're just going along with the changes in society and you think it's a good thing?
Well, I think as you become older, you do become wiser in many ways. And yes, I recognize the fact that construction is a big emitter of gases and turn to the atmosphere, etc. On the other hand, you have to have buildings, you have to have bridges, you have to have roads. Otherwise, how can we move things and transport things? The other things that I did, I can't talk about. I don't particularly want to talk about, but let us say I did a little on the dark side of life. Yes, in a way, I feel I'm compensating for that, but it's only in latter years that I've become aware of climate change and become aware of the kind of things that we are doing to the planet. And therefore, I want to try and make my contribution to try and, in my own modest way, try and stop a little bit of that happening. Having said that, I'm afraid climate change is rather like the great oil tanker, where it takes about 5 or 6 miles to change the course of because it's trundling along at 25 knots on the sea, and it's a massive object. And therefore, climate change, I'm afraid, is going to continue. Therefore, as a species, we've got to adapt to that. We've got to realize that climate change is going to happen, however far we try and mitigate it. And therefore, we must adapt and adapt and adapt.
Do you have any thoughts specifically about the construction industry in relation to their, shall we say, contribution to the situation?
Yes, I mean, the construction industry in many ways is a very conservative industry. It takes a long time to get into their heads that there are new ways of doing buildings, new ways of designing buildings, which would be much more, acceptable, which would move much less using less power and having less of an effect on the climate. I mean, in the 21st century, there's a lot of new technology around that could be used to build buildings, which would not be so damaging, shall we say? I mean, one of the problems in the UK, of course, is in our lack of proper insulation in our buildings. Therefore, using a lot more fossil fuels than we need to do so. Something can be done fairly easily about that if we really turned our mind to it with the right kind of government policies to promote that. Something can also be done about generating electricity in green ways rather than the dash for gas that the UK went for, over the last 30 years. There are all kinds of possibilities out there. And, I have to remind the construction industry that when they're no longer living in the 19th century, they're now living in the 21st century. And they've got to buck their ideas up to bring in these new technologies, these new ways of doing things. And the sooner they do that, the better for us all. Well, I started off with writing my first book, Manna from Heaven and Other True Stories. I've taken 7 episodes in my life. They're quite long stories, actually. But then I realized that much more had happened to me. So I started writing what I call shorter true stories. These are all events that have happened to me. They're all autobiographical. And I've now written something like 30 of these shorter true stories. Some of them are about my early life. Some of them actually happened before I was even born, but are based upon the facts as I know them. Others are about my business life, international finance, and other things that have happened to me. One is about the life of a very interesting gentleman that I met, and he told me the story of his life, and I thought it was worthwhile writing down, and I believe it to be true. He also was, shall we say, close to the intelligence agencies of the country concerned. So I now have the potential of bringing out 2 more volumes of stories, probably 15 shorter stories in each volume. And my next book is about ready now. It's called The Sound of Guns and Other True Stories, and I hope to bring it out later this year. The Sound of Guns, by the way, is a quotation which is attributed to the first Baron Rothschild, who once is reported to have said, "When you hear the sound of guns, buy." And the first story in the book is very apposite as far as the sound of guns is concerned. I won't tell you any more about it, but when it comes out, please buy the book and read the stories. Some of them are amusing, I think you'll find. Others are very, very serious.
Can you give us any kind of teasers?
Yeah. I mentioned the book about the story, about the gentleman that I believe his story to be true. He was acting for the American government in various ways, although he wasn't American, he was British. He carried out a series of operations for them in various countries. Also was employed to carry out certain activities, firstly in Afghanistan and then in Iraq. So he was a very interesting man. He's now passed away, sadly. And I took his stories. I endeavoured to check them out with an American friend of mine who has a certain background, shall we say, and he confirms that they are substantially true. Otherwise, I wouldn't put the stories in a book. Other of my stories, as I say, are amusing. There's a story about Hong Kong and my various visits there, and how I was led astray by he was an Australian gentleman, if I remember, in Hong Kong. And as I said, some stories about my childhood, my happy years before the crisis came with my father, first of all, and then the years after that crisis came, how I started my first job and my time at university. And I've already included in the book one of my love affairs before I met my wife, which failed for the reasons set out in the story. So I've tried to be as honest as I could possibly be about my life and about what has happened to me. All my stories are true. I've changed the names of the people involved for obvious reasons. I've never changed the locality except for the Africa country when I was involved with the vice president who then became president. I've withdrawn the name of that country, particularly. But they are all true. They all happened to me. And I wanted to share this with readers because I think that some of the stories are interesting and I hope that they enjoy reading them. We all live in different spheres of life. Some people, and I am very thankful that I've seen so much of the world and so many different and complex situations in so many different countries. I'm privileged from that point of view, but I want to avoid being egotistical about it. I want to share this experience really with other people to perhaps help them understand how some of the world and this kind of milieu actually works, how it makes difference to people's lives, and what shady things actually go on in the world to a certain extent. We are very ignorant of what happens at these kind of levels. So it's an educated process. I've learned the hard way for actually going through it, but I want to try and teach other people about my experiences so they can learn and experience it as well. If we don't pass the knowledge on, it will get lost, and something of life therefore gets lost. I suppose my stories are historical in the way that they've now passed decades of 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, and into the 21st century. But it's still, in a way, a historical document of how things worked then, but they still work like that. Certain people are in the elite, certain people are able to do things that nobody else can do. Certain people can stash their money away into offshore bank accounts, and the world of espionage still goes on. It has to, in a way, because otherwise the country is at a risk, and our way of life is at risk. I believe in our way of life. I believe in democracy and I believe in freedom, and that must be safeguarded at all costs.